Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Jordan here. I'm sure many of you saw the heartbreaking news. Congresswoman Maxine Waters brutally assaulted our sweet baby boy, Michael Tracy. If you watch the video frame by frame, you'll see she took a crowbar to his face, threw him to the ground, kicked him several times in the face, left him clinging to life on the Los Angeles pavement. So we just want to have a moment of silence for Michael Tracy. Thank you.
Jordan, I had to cut my mouth.
Welcome to the Think Twice podcast. I'm Jacob Schreiner-Briggs.
And I'm Jordan Yule.
And today we are joined by Andrea Chalupa. Andrea Chalupa is a New York-based writer. She graduated from the University of California at Davis with high honors in history and also studied at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Andrea has spoken on the subject of Ukraine at the 2014 World Forum for Democracy, the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., the Personal Democracy Forum at New York University, and more. Andrea is the author of Orwell and the Refugees, The Untold Story of Animal Farm, and is an accomplished social media activist who helped get Ukrainian protests trending at number one globally. Her work on the subject of Ukraine and Russia has been published in Time, Forbes, and The Atlantic, just to name a few. Please welcome Andrea Chalupa. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
First order of business, if you could just take some time and let the listeners know a little bit about yourself that wasn't incorporated in that bio, sort of the work that you do and how your interests have been shaped and so on, just how you've kind of gotten to where you're at today.
Sure. So I'm Ukrainian American, and I grew up in Northern California, which I think, breathing the air of the part of the world that gave humanity the computing revolution, the internet revolution, like the hippie revolution, all those things. I'm very patriotic when it comes to Northern California. So I take that with me everywhere I go. I'm now in New York City, which feels like home because my mom and dad grew up here. They were both born in refugee camps in Germany right after the war, and they came over to the U.S. by ship. My mom saw the Statue of Liberty when she first got to New York Harbor. That was her first sight of America. And now when I leave my block in Brooklyn, I see the Statue of Liberty right across New York Harbor. So for me, it's like a beautiful connection with a reminder of not only who I am and where I come from, but also what America means to me. So I take all of that with me in all the work that I do. So a lot of what I focus on right now, for the last couple of years, I'd say since 2012, 2011, has been Ukraine and Russia. I've been on this chaotic journey of writing and producing a screenplay about the journalists who risked their lives exposing Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine. And that got first picked up by Lars von Trier's company, and now it's with a Cannes Award-winning producer in Poland, and it has a wonderful team of European producers and a twice Oscar-nominated director on board. And we're casting, and it's been really exciting. And there's all these other projects that have sprouted from this project. So I'm working with a grant from the Canadian government to produce media literacy programming to university and high school students using the model of George Orwell, the lessons of Orwell's Life and Times, and how he was able to read through the newspeak of his age and get the truth out about Stalin's atrocities. So all of that is so relevant today, of course. So I've been really busy on the Ukraine and Russia front for years, and I've amassed a wonderful network of activists and journalists from Russia and Ukraine, and consider myself very, very lucky to get to know these people whose families' lives are on the front line, and how brave they are, how they continue to fight. So this whole period of time with Trump being president, my God, it's surreal to a lot of us who now have expertise that's suddenly in demand, and just sort of have been screaming about Putin's aggression for years, and especially the information war. So it's a very surreal time for us to sort of apply what we've been doing for many years now to the United States, as you can imagine. So yeah, so that's me in a nutshell.
Another fun fact for the listeners. So I'm sitting here on the line with two of the three organizers of the March for Truth. So as someone who's not an organizer, congratulations to both of you on what, from every single media clip I read and saw was a huge success. Congratulations to both of you on that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So Andrea and Justin Hendricks had to convince me to join them. I was the last person. So I can't really take as much credit as them because it really was their idea first.
We actually try to get you to do all the work. We try to delegate it to you. We said, we have this great idea.
Oh, yeah. Mission accomplished, folks.
Yeah.
So that march's popularity, I'm assuming part of it has to do with just the overwhelming amount of smoke associated with the Trump administration and connections to Russia, individuals in the Russian government. So, of course, we do want to have a conversation about that because it's one of, if not the most important topics facing American politics today. But I think before we get into the contemporary American side of things, I wanted to ask you a bit about some of the work that you've done regarding Ukraine and Russia so that we can get a better contextual understanding. Because I think that when Americans think about Russia and they think about Putin, there is a lot of reliance on heuristic devices that might be holdovers from the Cold War, who knows, but we just think Russia bad and we don't really stop to flesh out why that's the case, why Putin is an adversary, and why things like the annexation of Crimea are so troubling, especially with regard to Russian foreign policy. So I suppose starting with Ukraine and its history, if you could tell us a bit about Ukrainian history as relates to the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I'll cut to the punchline first, though. Not even to call it a punchline, but just sort of, the main sort of takeaway from this conversation has to be obviously, Russia itself clearly is not bad. Just like America itself is not bad. America is just suffering under a terrible government at the moment, and so is Russia. The Russian people are some of the warmest, friendliest people, and they're suffering under Putin, just like we're suffering under Trump. And if anything, our resistance here against Trump has to support the resistance there to Putin. Putin is a mafia state. It's unimaginable corruption to people in the West. You just can't fathom just like this level of corruption that they live under there, while the people themselves suffer. So that, just to put that out there. So when people, so that's what that whole ridiculous meme, that sort of lazy shorthand thinking that penetrates deeply on both the far left and the far right, that, oh, stop with this Russophobia, stop saying how everything's Russia's fault, Russia's bad. I'm sorry, but the fact is, Russia, the Russian people themselves, they're a victim as well, just as we are under Trump. So that's what people have to remember. And so just sort of how this whole relationship is with, Russia and Ukraine and everything that I've sort of been focused on in my writing, my research, my various projects related to that part of the world. It's very simply a story of colonialism. Ukraine is a country that historically is much older than Russia, far older. And it has a really beautiful, and the reason why I'm sort of starting with the history is because of recent headlines that have come out of Putin's meeting in France and other things I'll get to, and just sort of lessons of colonialism in general. So Ukraine has this gorgeous, gorgeous ancient history of one of the more influential kingdoms of Europe at a time. Around the 900s, the Kiev became this wonderful principality with relatively high literacy rates, relatively generous laws for women. There was a princess of the court, Anne of Kiev, who was married off to the French king, and she became the Queen of France. And we had these letters home from her back to Kiev saying how horrible the Franks were, how they were illiterate. They only had 3 dishes for dinner. Like they were just uncivilized. And The whole story of Anna of Kiev was so fascinating because it just showed how advanced the kingdom in Kiev was compared to other parts of Europe that we today think of as very cultured. And so Anne of Kiev went on to be a great king, earned praise from the Pope after her husband died, and kind of continued to basically rule France after when she was a widow. And all the lines of France's kings had Ukrainian blood in them. And so, Louis the 14th, the Sun King, when he during his coronation, he swore his oath to France. It is written on a Bible, on a Bible that Anne brought with her from Kiev. So that's in possession there. So yeah, and it's a beautiful story that Ukrainians take a lot of pride in. If you go to Kiev, you'll see statues to the heroes of that kingdom. It's very much, in their identity so even though Ukraine politically hasn't existed for centuries, the country itself exists through its history, through its stories, through its poetries, through its songs. It's something I don't know what else I could compare it to here in the U.S. But maybe how African American culture has sort of existed through its song, its music, in its struggle for independence. So a lot of that history and culture has created this Ukrainian identity that is very much a resistance culture. So during Ukraine's revolution, where they were overthrowing in 2013. Putin's puppet, Viktor Yanukovych, a man who was elected with the help of Paul Manafort, Trump's campaign chairman. So when Ukrainians took to the streets, they had on the front lines of the revolution, on the barricades, massive posters and murals of Ukraine's poets like Taras Shevchenko, Lesya Ukrainka, Ivan Franko, poets who had been dead for quite some time, but their language, Ukrainian, their words of, one day we'll be free from Russia, those things, carried the country through some very dark periods to sort of this beautiful sort of struggle for freedom. And just to sort of take a pause here, Putin, the Kremlin, as part of its massive information war, which we as Americans are witnessing as bots on the internet, etc., part of its information war is also to hijack Ukraine's history for itself. So when Putin was recently in France and meeting with the new president of France, one statement that the Kremlin released was that France and Russia have a long history together. Look at Anne of Kiev. Sort of claiming Anne of Kiev as their own. And that's just, a blatant, example of Russia's colonialism. And there's a very long list of it. And the trouble with sort of talking about this part of the world and this very hot conflict is that most journalists from the West enter this world through Russia's eyes. They're based in Moscow. Maybe they grew up reading Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, so they have a very Russian-centric focus on the conflict, and they sort of start inhabiting Russia's historical way of looking at Ukraine as a nothing little country that like sort of a backwater somewhere, sort of an uninteresting little place. And so that's been a big challenge in all of this, as well as the information war itself. So what was so critical of Euromaidan, the revolution, is that Ukrainians created their own story. They fought to tell their own story, and they stood up in front of the world and showed the world who they were. And they did that, by fighting for their lives, risking their lives in literally a fiery battle in the heart of Kiev, in bitter Arctic weather. And they did it beautifully, and it was something that began as a beautiful, peaceful cultural festival with music and art and poetry on the square, and it became a literal battle for their lives. And that was the moment where the world understood that no, actually, in fact, Ukraine is not Russia. and yeah, so I'll just take a pause there. But
so to follow up on all of that, a common Russian or Putin justification for moving into Crimea and for expansion deals with the high percentage of ethnic Russians in these nearby territories like Crimea, like the breakaway territories of Georgia. But so I've read some of your work, and you talk about the genocide in Ukraine, and so it seems, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. It seems to be the case that this sort of artificial justification was started at that point when it's Western Ukraine is right that's predominantly or more so than uh, or do I have that backwards? Eastern Ukraine is primarily.
Yeah. No, you're right. So right now, in this moment of time, Eastern Ukraine is predominantly like ethnic Russian, Russian speaking, whereas Western Ukraine is very Ukrainian, very patriotic, very pro, traditionally whatever Ukrainian. Um, and so you're referring to sort of my writing on how that's a very recent phenomenon, in fact.
Yes.
Yeah, very recent. So actually, about 80 years ago, uh, Eastern Ukraine was the hotbed of Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian identity. Some of the big thinkers of what it meant to be Ukrainian were in Eastern Ukraine and Ukrainian speaking. My grandfather on my mother's side is from Eastern Ukraine, and he wrote in Ukrainian. He spoke Ukrainian. He was very Ukrainian, and he was from that part of the country. So it was only around coming up on now 85 years ago when Stalin engineered an artificial famine where he sealed the borders of Ukraine, what they were at that time, and deliberately, systematically starved to death millions of Ukrainians. We're talking, I've interviewed survivors of this famine. Pulitzer Prize winning historian Anne Applebaum. She has a seminal book coming out on the famine. Timothy Snyder, who spoke at March for Truth, the author of the best-selling book on tyranny, he wrote he wrote heartbreaking work on this famine. The famine was done essentially to break this very strong spiritual Ukrainian national identity. Ukrainians, their culture, their language, all of it was very much tied to how they lived, like, in this agricultural system, and living off the earth, their communities on the land. And the Soviets needed them to fall in line and to collectivize farms, and Ukrainians were not having it. They were resisting. There were uprisings, and the way to make them fall into line was to just kill them off, get rid of them. And the famine got to be so bad that there was like 26,000 people dying a day at one point. And we'll never know the exact amount of people because the Soviets stopped taking the census during the famine. So the part of Stalin's crime is that we don't even have an exact figure, but the estimates range from anywhere from 4 million to 10 million. Stalin himself in Yalta told Churchill that they lost 10 million people in the famine. So the famine was known of in the rest of the world, but what was debated were the causes of it. So the Kremlin, even to this day, tries to push, it was a natural disaster, more than just Ukrainians died, get over it, famines happen. Whereas, Ukrainians themselves and a lot of major historical experts from Stanford University, Harvard University, Yale University, etc., have said no. Actually, this was a deliberate mass murder targeting Ukrainians by the Kremlin to get rid of them as a form of colonization. And so, in the part of the areas where the famine was hit the hardest, there were the most deaths, devastation, those areas are now predominantly ethnically Russian by families that have only been there for a few generations that sort of resettled the area over time.
So then it's a cruel irony then, because 80 years later, we have a justification put forth by the Putin government that supports their annexing of Crimea, and that justification is, well, this is a region or a part of Ukraine populated heavily by ethnic Russians, and they want to come home. Essentially, they want to be part of Russia once again. But if you study the history, like you have, it then becomes pretty clear that, well, the reason that's the case is because of prior atrocities engineered by former Russian leaders. And so I don't know, that's just deeply unsettling and really layers historically the sort of propaganda that's coming out of the Kremlin today.
Yeah, exactly. And Putin likes to see himself as a czar. He likes to sort of call on Russia's great imperialist periods, Catherine the Great and so forth. But he's also very Soviet as well, of course, with his, crushing of dissent, crushing of free speech, freedom of the press. and as well as allowing and sort of fostering Stalin to be resurrected in Russia. So you have statues going up to going up around Russia to Stalin. You have him being treated kindly in history books. There's a metro in Moscow that's been renamed after a iconic song from the Stalin period, and so forth. So he's really sort of like, whereas Hitler in Germany is completely banned, like any German leader that dared to do half the things this Putin's Kremlin has done to resurrect Stalin, that would be like a global outrage. But with Putin, it's really bizarre how he's tried to sort of reinstate Stalin as this great strong leader and not a mass murderer.
So on your point about rewriting history, this is something Chris Hedges he's written a lot about, and especially in War as a Force That Gives Us Meaning. He talks about warring states, and after conflict, the victor will typically rewrite history, and I think elements of that could be used to explain the covering up and misconstruing of the causes of the famine. I told you earlier, this is the first I've ever heard of it, was today. Are there other instances that you know of maybe something being completely rewritten for a pro-Russian or anti-Ukrainian perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll just tell you, it was a horror show going through Ukraine's revolution here in the West. Having friends in Kiev and just seeing what they were going through. What I mean by that is simply that, my God, when I look back on those days, you had outlets as respected as The Atlantic quoting RT as though it was a valid news source and it was just like surreal to see that. And the overwhelming narrative that was getting debated here in the West from very respectable outlets was how how the Ukraine's revolution was some quote neo-Nazi fascist uprising, and it was the neo-Nazis that were driving this. And that was like the overwhelming narrative that was getting pumped out through the Kremlin and making its way into Western outlets. And that's what we were all fighting for. So people like Tim Snyder and myself, others were writing articles saying that's simply not true. Ukraine's Jewish leaders are on the square themselves. They support the uprising. This is like an organic civic revolution that involves all walks of life. You had CEOs on the square. You had PhD students. You had kids with their mothers. Like it was just all hands on deck moment for that country. And yet it was getting boiled down to this very simple, crushing narrative of, well, should we or should we not support Ukrainians? Because aren't they just neo-Nazi fascists, all of them, like painting them with a broad brush? Like imagine if, I just don't know. I don't know what to compare that to. So what was really fascinating though was to, when Ukrainians won in their revolution, when Viktor Yanukovych was forced to flee to Russia, they had a new election. A new election was called, and when they went to the polls, the neo-Nazi leaders that were sort of overwhelmingly front and center in the Western narrative about the revolution, those neo-Nazi leaders ran for president, and their parties combined got less than 1% of the entire vote. Like they barely made it even to 1%. And there was like a Jewish candidate that got like 6% of the vote, and then like the pro-Western candidates got like the overwhelming rest of it. And so when that happened, when the numbers themselves spoke to the reality on the ground in Ukraine, that neo-Nazi narrative in the West disappeared.
So do you think this is an instance of Russian misinformation, how
Yes.
they just kind of
Yes.
relied on, because this kind of relates to how media will kind of pick sides and just go with it. I think a lot about the Israel-Palestine debate, and it seems to be in the United States, coverage is very often pro-Israel. And I had seen a study several years ago where the American media will report deaths of Israelis at a ratio of 4 or 6 to 1 for Palestinian deaths. And it gives people this false impression that Palestinians are really an overbearing aggressor. And then again, in another Chris Hedges books, I think actually that is War as a Force, he details his time at encampments there, and it just seems to be anything but. So could you talk a little bit about how this perhaps Russian misinformation is leading us to believe that there's like Nazi and fascist groups in Ukraine were front and center?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for years now, Russia's been investing in RT, Russia Today. It used to be just called Russia Today. And then they did a very smart thing and they just called it like a nice and clean RT. RT looks very professional, very trustworthy. And they pumped so much money into this. By one estimate of the budget, the annual budget was like $500 million. And they were very smart. They got RT in hotel rooms across Europe, across the US. They now have it in like gas station TVs. And what they were doing is they're using RT to show all the weaknesses of America. And that's very seductive for journalists in the West because, the whole point of being a journalist is speaking truth to power and holding the powerful accountable. So when you have RT that's feeding you, all these horrible things going on in America, and all the corruption in America, like you watch that compulsively. You start to rely on it as a source, and it becomes part of your job and the work you do. And so with RT then being a trusted source, it's almost like a Trojan horse, right? So with this credible information they're feeding about, some of the weaknesses of America, in comes this narrative of Ukrainians are neo-Nazis, they're not really a country to begin with, and all these other things that were sort of worming their way into credible mainstream outlets. So that's how it was done, essentially, like this whole Trojan horse strategy. And it's been like the same playbook since the Soviet period.
Oh, it should be. I mean, there are institutions within the United States that are leading similar campaigns elsewhere. So we are certainly not innocent in that regard.
No, but we're outspent. That's for damn sure. We're
Yeah.
very outspent by the Russians at this point. And in terms of they have they have a whole doctrine on the information war. Like they have their military on this in a way that we're still playing catch up. So their whole doctrine is winning a war without firing a shot. And cyber warfare, information warfare, it's very cost effective. And the war is essentially in people's minds. That's what it means. It becomes a war of ideas, and and a war of, as well as creating confusion. And you don't really know who to believe or what to trust anymore. So yeah, of course, the U.S. has a lot of a lot to sort of has a lot of dark arts as well in this department. But the Russians, my God, like they're doing it much better than we are. That's for sure. They're reaping a lot bigger award for their work, definitely.
And the state control of RT also has to be an important consideration, and it seems to just be another central tenet of the Putin doctrine, which I think it was Leon Aaron who wrote extensively about that. And Putin's sort of militaristic adventurism, and while that's going on, his need to put up the front of the besieged fortress and to communicate to the people that Russia is actually the victim, and constantly exposed to a limitless array of external threats. And because of that, the Russian people need to trust in the government to keep them safe. I think it was Anne Applebaum who was talking about a visit that she paid to Russia, and I think this was around the time when the passenger plane was shot down, and she was asking people on the so for the listeners, and you can speak with more accuracy to the finer details of this, I think, but it was a passenger plane in Ukrainian airspace that was shot down by pro-Russia separatists who may or may not have actually been Russian soldiers. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, no, absolutely right.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So Anne went into Russia and was asking just, Russian citizens, just what do you think happened? And the effect of propaganda, as she explained it, isn't that the Russians in response defended the government or said, well, there's no way that we would have done this, but rather said, well, there's no possible way that we can know. There's no way. Who knows what's true anymore? And really,
Exactly.
that to me seems to be the true effect of propaganda, that it's not necessarily getting people to buy into the government itself, but rather to reject the notion of fact and truth. And at that point, then, if everything's a wash and we can't have any hope of distinguishing between fact and fiction, we're just as easy then to manipulate and to control and to take advantage of as we would be if we were buying wholesale into the messages that the state was pumping out. But this seems to be a prime mover for Putin when he sort of makes these aggressive decisions to then inundate the people with misinformation and to essentially drive them into submission by fatiguing them and fatiguing fact checkers. And then if you have a journalist in Russia who is committed to revealing the truth, well, they mysteriously end up dead, it seems. So I don't know. I just think profiling Putin is so important, because if we're going to get real up in arms about the Trump connection, and if we're going to, as the March for Truth did, call for independent investigations, I really think it's important to sketch out for people why connection to Russia is something worth investigating, why it's not just like any other relationship that we would have with, say, a Western European country like France or England or Germany, but rather we're dealing with an aggressive state that relies on state-run propaganda, and that I think needs balanced out by not an adversarial United States, but by a cautious United States. So I don't know. I know I put a lot on the table there, but I'd like to get some of your thoughts on some of what I just said.
Yeah, no, definitely. So the bottom line is that Russia doesn't know how to not be an empire. It's still expansionist. It invaded Georgia. It invaded Crimea first, then eastern Ukraine. It's heated up tensions with the Baltics. Like an Estonian security agent was kidnapped. And held for ransom, basically. There's still dozens of political prisoners inside Russia from all over that sort of part of the world. There's a filmmaker, a Crimean filmmaker, Oleg Sentsov, who was kidnapped from Crimea. He was a human rights activist. He's a filmmaker who showcased his work in European festivals, and he was just snatched from Crimea, taken to Russia, and quote unquote sentenced to 20 years in prison, where he's still being held today. Penn International, major filmmakers across Europe have at major film festivals and award ceremonies have done all types of campaigns to try to release him, and the Kremlin just simply does not care. So all of that is important because it shows you the values of Putin's regime. It's an aggressive regime. It's a regime that does not respect borders. It does not respect human rights, and it does not respect its neighbors. And it's a regime that blatantly, grossly interferes with, elections in Western Europe, elections, in our presidential election. So all of that is to say that when you have such an aggressive regime, it's just the only way to curb it is to stand up to it as a united front in an international alliance, and that's through sanctions. No one wants to go to war with Russia, and Russia knows that. That's why Russia starts screaming its head off about nuclear war. So during the final months of the election, it kept, it started doing these really insane, elaborate drills, preparing for nuclear war, a nuclear holocaust in Russia. And all of that was a hysterical threat to say if Clinton wins, she's going to go to nuclear war, and this is going to be nuclear war and the end of humanity, that sort of thing. And that narrative took hold. You saw that spinning around, whether it was the paid bots doing it or just, people from the far left and far right who picked up on this and push and helped the bots push that narrative. So the bottom line is that Russia is an expansionist state. It's aggressive, and it wants to regain its former glory of having satellite states like Ukraine and Belarus like stuck in its orbit, and because the Soviet Empire was not a union of different states that share the common vision. It was essentially the Russian Empire. They all sort of, to different extents, reported back to the Kremlin, and they all were closed societies that fell under the secret police playbook that was driven by the Kremlin. And so the Kremlin wants to regain that glory of empire, but unfortunately, the version of empire by the Kremlin is autocracy. So unfortunately, when you live in an autocracy like any of those Soviet states, they breed rot and corruption, which is very difficult to crawl out of. Even Poland is having a difficult time achieving full democracy. They've slipped back into a bit of a difficult situation now with this current administration. So what people have to remember is Russia's aggression, the end game of it, is essentially creating black holes of corruption, which can last for generations, and no one really knows how to defeat them and get out of them. That's something that the development community in the West is desperately struggling with. So people have to remember the end game of the Kremlin's aggression is it's like this greedy feeding frenzy of empire, but when they control these states, they basically destroy them for generations. Where we in America, we're very vulnerable to our own oligarchy. Sort of, it's taken hold, and it's got a huge win with Trump as president now. And if we allow them to succeed, then we might be stuck and become like the sort of the level of corruption that we have now in the U.S. will be nothing compared to what it might be 10 years from now. And people have to understand that.
This seems to be a good point then, to transition into where we are right now with the interplay between the United States government and Russia. So we understand now that we're talking about an aspiring autocracy that is currently pretty autocratic, but that is seeking to expand, and that doesn't really care what means it has to employ to do that. And now we have the United States government, which is supposed to be the beacon of Western values and popular sovereignty and transparency. We have that government, our government, now, at the very least, supposedly connected to the Russian government. And so I don't know, if you two want to kind of talk about the March for Truth. There's just so much going on in the news. The headlines change every day. The propaganda machine, at least domestically, I think is trying to obfuscate a lot of this. I don't know. I mean, it's tough to get a hold of exactly what's going on, but I know that it certainly feels disheartening and frightening to a degree, to think that our current administration is in cahoots one way or the other with some extension of the Putin government, if not Vladimir Putin himself. So I don't know what you guys think about that.
Well, yeah, I think, when you have a businessman like Trump, that Western institutions no longer feel comfortable loaning to, someone who's gone through multiple bankruptcies, who refuses to pay back contractors he owes several thousands of dollars to, someone whose reputation is just shot, and who's so closely financially associated with, the Russian mafia here in New York City. I think it's clear to say that this is somebody who, is very likely very linked to Russian oligarchs around Putin, and to be a successful Russian oligarch inside Russia, it's like there's one man that you answer to, and that's Putin and his and as well as his entourage. And so you can pretty much do whatever you want as long as you are careful to remain within their favor. And so if Trump is being floated by Russian oligarchs for his businesses, obviously we see that they're buying up a lot of his properties. And there's some very suspicious purchases as well that have been reported. There's one estate that went for way above asking price, like a really dumpy, like McMansion that he needed to get rid of, and in came a Russian oligarch to bail him out. So the bottom line is there that Trump could very likely be financially linked to Russia very deeply. I mean, his own son has admitted as much. So if he's financially linked, he's also ideologically linked. Ideologically linked in the sense that he's somebody that has no problem with corruption, like in Putin's mafia state, has no problem with kleptocracy, has no problem with, breaking the rule of law, all the things that if we lose, our society could slip very quickly into being, a black hole of corruption.
Could you perhaps explain, because I think some people get really caught up in this story, people who hate Trump get really energized by this, and they see the stuff that you're talking about that's been reported, and they run with it to the point where Putin is dictating every move Trump does, like the Putin's puppet thing, and like I see people on Twitter replying to
You're
Trump
the puppet.
Shavana. Yeah, yeah, and I guess that could be where it started. But people are like claiming Putin dictates everything. And I know some of it's just kind of like poking fun, but I think there are people that genuinely believe that Putin is bossing around Trump. So maybe you could shed some light on how being indebted to these people might lead him to make decisions that are sympathetic to them, and perhaps not being completely ordered around by them.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's certainly not that he's getting it's not like he's getting these instructions from the Kremlin itself. I mean, the whole sort of infiltration game is a soft power game in many ways. It's a lot of, Trump is a very easy mark. He's just like walking, living, breathing ego. One of the questions he had about, why does he never stand up to Vladimir Putin, somebody that, kills opposition leaders and journalists? And Trump said, well, why would I insult a guy that calls me a genius? And so the man is a very easy mark. And he's somebody that like craves acceptance and has, as we've seen, has very thin skin. So he's certainly the sort of whole infiltration of these Russian interests are just people that have like bailed him out, easy money when he needs it. I'm sure it's like having an ATM machine, because the Russians just have the Russian oligarchs just have like so much money, and they need to move it out of Russia. They need to launder it. By doing so, it's like greater security for them, just moving it out of such an unstable place as Russia, where if Putin wants to, if he needs to sort of, steal from them for whatever reason, which he's done to his oligarchs, he could do so. So they know that that they're, by the nature of where they live, it's precarious. So they like to move their money around for greater security. And so Trump has given them out in properties that they buy from him. He could be facilitating that. So that's all it is. It's just easy, cheap Russian money, and just the acceptance and the flattery and the sort of nouveau riche-ness of Russian oligarchs that's in Moscow. That's very over the top. The wealth, the beautiful women, the furs, all those things, like the gold plated everything. Like that's something that these sort of nouveau riche types also share with him. So it culturally, ego stroking, financially, all of it really makes sense. It's not like Putin is like calling in with his daily instructions.
Yeah, well, that we know of. So one of the things you said, and I think this is an interesting point, the question is often posed to him, like, why won't you stand up to Putin? And I think a lot of people who are skeptical on this issue make a really valid point. Like, why do we want to upset a nuclear power? And I think this is something we need to consider when we have these debates. And especially that's why every time I talked to the media about March for Truth, I was very deliberate. This is just about an independent investigation, because to misconstrue that and then also be the aggressors toward Russia could have lethal consequences. So could you talk about how you might see an ideal situation for, say, another person to address this issue, or this whole idea of Trump standing up to Putin, and why or why not that might be good or bad?
Well, no one wants to go to war with Russia, not at all. And there's ways to contain Russian aggression so we don't escalate it into a war. These methods like sanctions and isolation and kicking them out of the G8, etc., those methods work. and we know they work because Putin starts screaming about nuclear war, and that the West wants nuclear war, and he starts doing these nuclear war drills. He's desperate when he does that. It's like a little kid throwing a tantrum, and he's trying to scare us because what we're doing is working. So Trump standing up to Putin isn't going to drag us into some, NATO standoff with Russia. No, both sides can't afford that. War is extremely costly, and that's why the Russians have essentially perfected cyber warfare and information warfare, because they cannot, until they invent AI robots, they can't afford a war. Just their military excursions in Syria, that's politically costly for Putin, as is his invasion of Russia. Because he enjoys a lot of support right now inside Russia, but if he starts creating too many widows and mothers start losing their soldier sons to unpopular wars in Ukraine and Syria, that's going to feed that's going to just turn people against him. So people need to stop worrying about some like World War III with Russia. It's simply not in Putin's interest at all. What he wants is to simply be respected and allowed back into the club, and he's going to throw his tantrums until we do. And in the meantime, we keep him out of the club until he pulls out of Crimea, pulls out of Ukraine, because what he wants more than anything is that global respect.
So one of the approaches you mentioned is sanctions, and what we should consider is, in some instances, and I'm by no means an expert on where we are right now with Russian sanctions, but in some instances, those do have trickle-down effects and unfairly punish the citizens of sanctioned countries. Could you talk about the dilemma or the ethical dilemma, perhaps, of sanctioning Russia as an alternative to conflict?
I think I think the pressures that sanctions put on a country are far better than the alternative of going into a hot war, always. And in fact, the sanctions have had a positive effect in some examples inside Russia. So, for instance, Putin stupidly sanctioned the EU by cutting off like supplies, like certain products from the EU. So no more French cheeses on the shelves in Moscow. And that was really funny because it's like, okay, well, you don't get our delicious French cheese. You're punishing yourself.
Yeah, their loss.
but what ended up happening is that those artisanal cheesemakers inside Russia suddenly had a boom in business. And so that became like a huge positive. So I think the sanctions are a much better alternative always. And what it does is, when you have a mafia state like Russia, it's ran by, it's ran by oligarchs who have just unimaginable wealth. And they like to, they send their kids abroad to schools in London and Switzerland. They love to go on these skiing trips to the Alps. They love to be in the high society in the West and go to Aspen. And when you sanction them, when you put their names on sanctions lists, like that's a major black eye to them socially. Like they are not going to be welcomed in these museum banquets and so forth, and sort of it's like you're ostracizing them socially, and that kills them. So sanctions are very strong for people who are ostentatious with their wealth and just want to be jet setters and accepted globally, and that's what we have to understand is that's where all our power lies, is making these kids be stuck away from the cool kid table.
So this brings us, I think, to the question at hand. I think it's the question of evidence. So when we talk about the Trump administration's connection to Russia, and the names change every day, but we have Manafort, we have Page, we have Flynn, we have Kushner recently, we have Sessions. It's a pretty long list, but a lot of detractors and Trump supporters, or maybe not supporter at this point, but at the very least Trump defenders, their arguments primarily rest on what they're claiming to be a lack of evidence. And a lot of them point to the fact that the sources relied upon by organizations like the Washington Post and the New York Times are anonymous. But essentially, I think the crux of their argument is this, if not fake news, is unsubstantiated. We don't know who these anonymous sources are. There's no smoking gun. And because the media has been aligned against Donald Trump since the beginning, this is just another way for them to continue to diminish his legitimacy in the eyes of the American people, and so on and so forth. So at that point, the question becomes, what is the evidence? How much of it is there actually? And what do we need to do moving forward to obtain evidence, or to discover that there isn't any, but in either case to reach a conclusion that is nonpartisan, non-political, and legitimate?
Yes, I mean that's the question on those are the questions on everyone's mind. The first thing is that investigations, especially of this scope, just they're going to take a very long time. I mean, this Russiagate dwarfs Watergate. Like anybody making Watergate comparisons, they just don't compare anymore. This is just far greater. Like the scope is just
Is that because of
massive
the
compared to.
geopolitical implications?
Yes, absolutely, and just you have so many more players, and who are caught up in this, and Watergate itself took a couple years, right? So when you have a scandal that just so much so far reaching, greater than Watergate, this is going to take a while to nab everybody that should be nabbed. So people just have to understand that the legal process takes time. Investigations take time. So once the FBI concludes its investigations and makes its recommendation to the DOJ, then the legal process that follows, that itself is going to take time. If you look at the case of this Ukrainian oligarch who is, close with the Kremlin and close with Paul Manafort, his name is Firtash. I mean, it's taken the U.S. government forever just to try to get him here, and that's just one guy. And we had enough on him to even to nab him, but it's still just the whole thing gets hung up in court with both sides, the lawyers going at each other. So it's going to be a mess, and it's going to take a very long time. And so people should not sit around binge watching Twitter. They should be engaged in whatever efforts they want to adopt and dedicate themselves to, like Swing Left, the Town Hall Project, whatever it is to really focus on to make their massive mark on 2018 and 2020. If you want to impeach Trump, you have to win back the House. That's the simplest, easiest way to do it.
One of the points on the evidence question, that was something I got a couple times when we were talking about March for Truth with media, and yesterday someone just point blank asked me, well, where's the evidence? It's important to remember they're not going to, like in any criminal investigation, evidence is treated as sensitive material. They're not going to release it midway through. The FBI, Comey admitted, he testified, there is an active investigation. They would not compromise their investigation by releasing the evidence. And I think skeptics on this issue just go with the low-hanging fruit. Where is the evidence? Like assuming that there's just like loads of it hanging out there, if there is none, and it's a matter of security clearance and just how these types of investigations operate. The FBI would not testify they're investigating Trump if nothing was happening, or if they simply weren't. Like why would he say that? So we need to give it, like Andrea says, we need to give it time.
I wanted just to comment really quickly on evidence. It's, my God, it's all ICs, like the all intelligence communities, they spy on each other. When Ed Snowden did like the whole NSA leaks, and Germany acted so outraged that we were spying on them, and then we discovered, then it came out that they were spying on us, including Germany was spying on U.S. journalists. So everyone spies on everyone. So in terms of evidence, the leaks we have that are being driven by very likely by the intelligence community itself. These guys must have plenty of interesting conversations on tape, and they must be using this to sort of negotiate, pulling more information out of people like Michael Flynn and Paul Manafort who are coming in for interviews and whatever. One thing that I think is really interesting, and who knows how this has been used so far on this Russiagate any of these investigations, is something that that they offer called Queen for a Day, where if you're under investigation, you have one day where you can come in and you can just lay it all out on the table, what you have, what you're working with. Like, you can show your cards, and the information that you share that day, you're safe. They can't touch you, and then they can decide from what you offered them that day whether they're going to cut a deal with you for like a lesser sentence or immunity. So all of these sort of things you sort of imagine are getting worked out, but to what end, of course. So I'm just saying, in terms of evidence, it's not going to be some like sex tape with Trump and Putin together with like underage boys. It's not going to be that. It's going to be just a lot of conversations that have been caught, I'm sure, and like a lot of pieces that are being connected.
And people out there saying on Twitter that there is a videotape or a tape of Trump laying out an offer to Putin and all of these grandiose claims. People really need to be skeptical of that kind of stuff. Like you just said, it's not going to be something like that. If you see someone on Twitter claiming they have this type of information, don't believe them.
Yeah, I mean, of course, all of this stuff sounds plausible because it's Trump, and so you can't really blame people for making these claims because the guy is just, nuts.
Stupid. But
right. But yeah,
it's
but
also
yeah,
confirmation bias. Like, they want to believe it, so they'll take these things and just they'll believe it because that's the end game. That's what they want.
And then we bump back into the fake news problem and the nature of propaganda. Effective propaganda in this country, like in Russia, will not result in people saying Trump is the best, USA, but rather, well, we can't know because it's impossible to know, who's telling the truth and who's not. But that's just as bad, if not worse, I think, in a lot of ways. Well, here's a question from me for both of you, actually. Do you to have faith in Robert Mueller, or is part of the March for Truth a testament to the fact that you don't necessarily, or you think there needs to be more, or whatever it may be? I mean, do you think right now that the status quo in terms of special counsel is enough, or do we need more in terms of oversight and investigative authority?
I definitely have faith in Mueller. It's, for us, March of Truth was really naming and shaming Congress. I just got back from D.C. where I saw a staffer on the House side, and he was just telling me, it's dead. It's dead. The Republicans don't care about Russia and Ukraine. And then I saw, a friend that worked in another branch of government, and this friend was saying sanctions are going to get lifted. That's the end game. And then right after, Michael Isikoff's big piece in Yahoo News dropped saying that as soon as the Trump administration came in, they were working on a plan to lift Russian sanctions immediately. So, everybody's waiting for this grand bargain in between Trump and Putin, and there it was, sanctions. So, it's Congress really that you have to put pressure on, and it's building this political infrastructure to join the other infrastructures that have been built out there by Indivisible and Women's March and Move On, etc. It's building a political infrastructure of people who are deeply disturbed about Russia. They don't want to be a Russian satellite state by having someone like Trump, who's ideologically, financially aligned with the Kremlin and Russian Kremlin interests, and so it's about fighting like literal authoritarianism creeping into the U.S. It's people who are thinking in terms of not this year or next year, where things might be relatively easy for us, but 5-10 years from now, when these guys take an even greater hold of the U.S. government and the court system, etc. So it's really thinking long term, and it took years for us to get to this place. It's going to take us years to get out. And so it's all about March for Truth for many of us across the U.S. was about naming and shaming the GOP. That just is putting party before country.
So I guess then, probably maybe nearing the end of our time here, a question I'd pose again to both of you as co-organizers of yesterday's March for Truth. So what do we do from here? So obviously we have to wait for these processes to play themselves out, and we don't have any direct influence in how that happens. And we know it's going to be long and tedious, and it might be years until we actually know what these sort of investigations will yield. But in the meantime, what advice would you two have for people listening, or people following on the news, or people on Twitter who are seeing these things and feeling disenchanted or like their backs are against the wall? What advice do you have for people like that, in terms of how they can get involved and how they can hold government accountable, not just in the short term, but in the long term?
What people can really do is go to townhallproject.com, find your local representative's town hall, and show up. Especially if you're in red states or swing districts, toss-up seats, you really need to get engaged. You need to talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, make sure everyone is registered to vote, and go to the town hall, have your voice, or call your member of Congress, call daily if you have to, but make sure you keep putting pressure on them, because they will not act until this becomes politically toxic for them.
How about you, Andre? Any words of wisdom?
Yeah, absolutely. People have to remember that Vladimir Putin and Robert Mercer are the same threat. At the end of Animal Farm, you have the pigs and the men eating together, celebrating together, and you can't tell one from the other. That's exactly what we're up against. It's just plain, pure corruption and, disrespect, living above the rule of law. Propaganda. Robert Mercer's an investor in Cambridge Analytica, which is militarized propaganda. So this is a war for the mind. This is an information war. That's what we're up against. This is a war against oligarchy, kleptocracy, total disregard for the rule of law. That's what this, very far right Robert Mercer funded element that's infiltrated the U.S. government with Russia's help. It's the same threat. They're united together against the American people. And if they succeed, if we get lazy, if we allow ourselves to get tired, their infiltration will just go deeper and deeper. And pretty soon we're not going to recognize America anymore. And that's serious. This is not a drill anymore. This is real. This is happening now. And if you ever get tired, take a break, take a walk, do whatever you need for yourself, for self-care. But you must be an active citizen now, as though your life depends on it, because it does. The lives of your children, your grandchildren, all of it depends on it now. What's happening in America, the tools that Russia used to help elect Donald Trump with the hacking and the propaganda war, that was tested on Ukraine first. And Ukraine successfully resisted many of those attacks because Ukraine has a long history and knew who its enemy was, and knew Russia, and didn't think any of this was far-fetched or like a spy novel. They knew it was reality. Americans were blindsided because they thought this was all a silly conspiracy theory spy novel, and now look at where we are. So to that end, like Jordan said, find a strategy to get Democrats elected into the House and the Senate in 2018, then show up again early for 2020 and then 2022. Just keep doing this. Like, you are now an engaged citizen for the rest of your life until you die. All of us are. This is in our social lives now. Our brunches are now marches. It's fun. It's great. It energizes you. We're so lucky to have each other, and you meet the coolest people doing it. And just remember that. And it's this wonderful spiritual struggle that we're in, that's a long tradition in America. Progress takes time and progress takes work, and we're going to get there together.
That's a perfect segue. Your Cambridge Analytica comments, that is, for one of our upcoming episodes this week with Justin Hendricks. Have you met him before?
He's kind of annoying.
Oh man, are we playing this? Or are we cutting it?
No, we're playing
we're gonna turn up the volume on it and maybe do some like auto tune. No, Justin Hendricks is like one of Jordan will vouch for me. Like I'm madly in love with Justin Hendricks because he is by and far like the most emotionally stable human being alive, and a lot of that is why March for Truth was so successful, because he was just such a brilliant manager.
Yeah, he was the force behind. He wanted zero credit the entire way. He was completely out of the spotlight, but he was the driving force. He was fantastic. But he's Tuesday, I think we're gonna record with him, and we're gonna talk Cambridge Analytica. I'm really excited for that episode. So it was perfect that you teased the Mercer bit.
Great. I mean, we're all kind of the one mind now after all the time we've spent together
I
this
know.
last month. So
I have a habit. I just like every couple hours, I just like think to myself like, oh, I need to call Justin because we've been calling each other so many times over the past month. It's gonna be a hard habit to break.
I keep expecting to get texts from him telling me to do stuff.
Well, I think this was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you both so much. Really, this is really, I really enjoyed it because I got to do all the talking.
Thank you so much for coming on, and hopefully we can have you on for future podcasts because I'm assuming we'll have more to talk about as this moves forward. So.
I know. Yep, I'm here for you.
Right, well, thank you, Andrea. If you like what you've heard today and want to support the podcast, follow us on Twitter at ThinkTwicePod and like us on Facebook at ThinkTwice.
And check out our website, thinktwicepodcast.com. And we could absolutely use your support. Please visit patreon.com/thinktwice to view subscription options. For as little as $5 a month, you can support our work. $5. That's 1 cup of coffee a month. Thank you.